Good evening, Tucson. My name is Joaquin Ruiz. I'm the Dean of the College of Science, and I thank you so much, all of you, for coming here tonight. Many of you have been with us for many of these lecture series, but I have to remind you that today is the 10th anniversary of these lecture series. And importantly, what everybody should recognize in this room is that although I think we've helped create some kind of community through the lecture series, which we're very proud of, all of you have also helped create a community within the University of Arizona just by the way that we create these lectures. Just to give you a sense of how it all works out, there's a little group that sits down one day and they say, okay, what's the next lecture series? My God, I don't know, we're running out of themes. And somebody will come up with a theme that sounds like it's reasonable, and then we pick up our Rolodex and we call faculty from the university to say, will you give a lecture? And then they'll get together and they themselves create the lecture series as you know it. And if I could do anything that would be truly extraordinary is to be able to film the deep conversations of the speakers as they're creating the lecture series for you. So they are the ones that deserve a great round of applause, because all we do is come up with a theme and sort of duck after that. Because this is a 10th lecture series, the 10th anniversary, we felt that it had to be something that was truly unique and that would be memorable. And of course, we've had many memorable and unique lecture series. We've had evolution of the brain, we've had cosmology, we've had genomics, each one of those full of mystery and full of things we don't know. And the hope of all of us and the lecturers and me is that by the time you hear all these lectures, you know about as much as everybody that's giving the lectures, perhaps without the mathematics and all these other little things, but that you understand all the grand challenges and that you really sort of get a sense of what we know. I hope we're good at that. I hope that we give you lectures that stretch you, that don't bore you, and that in the end spark your imagination about what amazing things are being discovered by all of us. This lecture series is on life in the universe. What could be more stretching than that? Are we alone? Are we not? What does that mean in a cosmological way? What does that mean in a biological way? And we have for you what I think is an extraordinary lecture series. It has a couple of biologists that will tell you, because in fact what we are is planet-centric, and what is it that we're actually looking for in other planets? What do we understand about life in our own planet? And then the rest of the speakers will spend their time trying to convince you that the science that they're doing is worth something, and that they know what they're looking for, and that maybe they will find something. Today's lecturer is perhaps the key lecture in the whole lecture series, because Guy Consolmagno, Brother Guy, is going to try to define what life is. And if you're trying to find something somewhere else, you might as well know what you're trying to find if you're going to find it. So that's what this lecture is about. But before I introduce Brother Guy, I would like to thank the sponsors of this lecture series that really have made it possible for all of us to be in this room for 10 years in a row. And the two main folks that have been giving a substantial amount of cash to make this all free for the rest of us is Tucson Electric Power and Ventana Medical Systems, and I thank them for being the lead sponsors of the lecture series. And the other amazing partner in all of this, if it wasn't for them, you probably wouldn't even know what we're trying to do, and that is the Arizona Daily Star. They have been just absolutely incredible in trying to work with us to make sure you all know that this is happening. Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Galileo Circle, which are friends of the College of Science, GODAT Design. All these designs that you see here are from GODAT. Halualoa Companies, Hugh and Alan Thompson, the Marshall Foundation, Miraval Resort and Spa, Raytheon Research Corporation for Science Advancement, and Vantage West Credit Union are the other folks that have been supporting us handsomely for all these years, and I thank you. And I ask you all to thank me, help me thank them. Now let me tell you a little bit about Guy. Guy, I urge you all to Google Guy and Colbert. I think that's all I have to say. And I don't think I've ever seen anybody in the Colbert Report that actually made Colbert crack up and be speechless. So we're in for a treat with Brother Guy. Brother Guy got his PhD at the University of Arizona in the Department of Planetary Sciences. His main interest is in small celestial objects and how they work within the solar system. So he looks at asteroids and so on. He is the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. The Vatican Observatory has an observatory in Mount Graham next to the Large Binocular Telescope. I'm sure if you ask Brother Guy, he'll take you up there and show you the beautiful telescope. He's written more than 200 articles, scientific articles. He has a bunch of books on outreach. This year he was awarded the Carl Sagan Award in Outreach in Science. Quite an honor for astronomy. He's just sort of amazing. After Guy got his PhD here, he went to sort of more mediocre places to continue his research. He went to Harvard and he went to MIT. And after that, he felt that since they didn't have anything to offer, he went to Kenya to join the Peace Corps. And after Kenya, he went to the American Siberia, and he went to Pennsylvania to teach. That made him a Jesuit, and he joined the order after that. So I give you Father Guy Consolmagno.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Once again, it's a delight to be back in an auditorium which I only remember as a student for having jazz bands. I'm hoping that I'll be almost as entertaining. And it's an interesting topic they've put up there. What is life? Now, life is nice, life is good, but it's not really down to earth, you know? And I'm a geologist. I like to be down to earth. This is the kind of stuff I'm interested in. It's plagioclase. Now, plagioclase is one of these minerals that appears in almost all of the meteorites that I study in my geology lab. It's an essential part of a lot of the rocks that we have. I mean, granted, we take it for granted sometimes, but in fact, that's basalt. But the great thing about plagioclase is not only can it be beautiful with these lovely colors and this lovely different shapes and forms, and now the geologists are going to say, wait a minute, some of those are orthoclase, not plagioclase. So we should really define what is plagioclase. That's an essential thing to know. Plagioclase actually has an important role in human life. It's the active ingredient in the cleanser that you use to clean your sinks. How could we live without plagioclase? So I suggest that I would really like to explore the chemistry of plagioclase, the incredibly complicated chains and cages of the plagioclase, which is formed by these little tetrahedra of silica, and they've got 4 oxygens on the outside, and then they surround the cations, and depending on the cations, you can get the different kinds, and the crystal can grow bigger and bigger and bigger as the lava gets more and more. It's fascinating. It's so fascinating that, in fact, I think I'm going to change the theme of this to plagioclase in the universe. Today we'll talk about what is plagioclase. And after we've determined that, planet formation and the origin of plagioclase, very important stuff. Plagioclase is plagioclase. It's such a beautiful mineral. Did it just happen by chance? Complexity and evolvability. What makes plagioclase so interesting? Hunting for plagioclase in the solar system. There was a space probe that went to asteroid Vesta. I could tell you all about asteroid Vesta. Half of the rocks on the surface of asteroid Vesta are made of plagioclase. Amazing discoveries. We're now thinking that there's 1 billion planets that may have plagioclase on their surface. Plagioclase. This would be a... I get the impression that if we had a 7-part series on plagioclase in the universe, we might not draw the same crowd that came tonight. I gotta admit. This is an important thing to remember. If you're going to define life in terms of its chemistry, of its long-chain molecules, of its beautiful structures and forms, you're going to have to keep asking yourself, is this really what makes life interesting enough to have a 7-part series? And if we come up with a definition that is no better than plagioclase, then we've missed something essential about what makes life fascinating and important to us. So let's drink to life. I was once a rabbi in the MIT production of Fiddler on the Roof. When you ask, what is life, you can ask the philosophical question, what gives me the fullness of life? In other words, what is at the center of what life is that makes life interesting to me? The philosophy question is concerned not so much with distinguishing life from non-life, but from actually figuring out what life itself is. The scientific question, on the other hand, might be more, what are the criteria I can use to determine life from non-life? I went to a book, Biogenesis by Noam Lahav, Theories of Life's Origin. And in the center, he has 48 different definitions of life dating to the middle of the 19th century. We're going to take a look at some of those. But before I do, I want to remind you that there are 3 different kinds of definitions. All of them important, all of them different, all of them hopeless. The boundary definition, this is life, that's not life, there's the boundary. Well, I think that's pretty easy. Life is anything that occurs on a planet rather than a dwarf planet, right? Those of you who fought the Pluto wars will get the joke. It's easier to define what's a planet and what's not a planet sometimes than to define what's life and what's not life. The central question is, what is it at its core that makes life something that we're going to have a packed house for 7 weeks trying to figure out what it is? But for the scientists looking for life in the universe, the much more practical question is, what's the gizmo we can build that will give us a yes or no answer that everyone will believe? Now, we've got Carl Sagan here, next to a model of the Viking lander. Viking landed on Mars in 1976. And it had 3 experiments that were going to look for life, 4 actually, because Carl insisted it also had to have a camera in case any, silicon giraffes walked by. I won't go into the details of the experiments except to say that when they got the results back, they knew that if they got this result, it would mean there was some life on the surface. If they got that result, it would mean there was no life on the surface. And instead, they got a 3rd result, because they had made too many assumptions about what life would do, and they had built their experiments to look for what they were looking for. The philosophers of science say that every experiment is theory-laden. You do the experiment knowing ahead of time what the answer ought to look like, and you have to, because otherwise, how would you know the answer if you saw it? But this has been an issue in trying to figure out how to search for life ever since we've been thinking of searching for life. Now, I mentioned the 48 descriptions. Here's a couple of them I want to share with you. The vital forces are molecular forces. It's T.H. Huxley. Huxley and Darwin, well, let's just say if you ever saw the Marx Brothers movie where they're at a college, the two colleges were Darwin College and Huxley College, and they were the big rivals. 1868, that's important because this is the time when most of science is convinced that Newtonian physics has the answers to everything. There was a great physicist who should have known better who once said, all of science is either physics or stamp collecting. But the vital forces, there was a theory going around that said that there was some kind of called vitalism, and that there was some magic force that created life. And Huxley saying, no, the only force that's happening inside a living entity are the forces in the molecules themselves. This is the height of the mechanistic view of the universe. It's a very Victorian view. It's a very naive view. It's the view most biologists have. And thus, Browning a year later could say, there is no boundary between life and non-life. Now, for the Marxists in this room, Friedrich Engels points out that death is an essential factor in life. If you can't kill it, it was never alive. Well, maybe. By 1929, life can be eliminated from the scientific vocabulary since it is an indefinable abstraction. But of course, by 1929, we're already beginning to see that the world is not quite as simple as the Newtonian mechanists wanted it to be. So we have Horowitz in 1959 saying, well, we can make a list of things that life does. Mutability, it changes. Self-duplication, it reproduces. Heterocatalysis. Ooh, I like that word. I had to look it up in Google. I probably have it wrong in my memory. Basically, a catalyst, as you might recall, is a little lump that doesn't do change at all during a chemical reaction, but it promotes the reactions. And there are autocatalysts which make more of themselves, and there are heterocatalysts which make things that are a little bit different from themselves but continue to be catalysts. Now, we got the 60s. How many people here remember the 60s? You weren't there. Self-realization of the potentialities of atomic electron state. Ah, that explains it. Now I know what life is. I can build a machine that will look exactly for that. Multiplication, heredity, variation, kind of a similar system as before. By 1997, we're into the electronic age, the computer age, the information age. So now we know that life is a flow of energy, matter, and information. What is information? Oh, we should have a 7-part series on what is information. Information in the universe. This book itself ends up with a definition that life, having evolved from inanimate matter, life constitutes autocatalytic, evolvable, telenomic organic systems that can transfer, store, and process information based on template and sequence-directed reactions, all of which characterize autopoietic entities. So I've got a list of words up there. If you can find synonyms for them in one syllable. Autocatalytic, it makes more of itself. Evolvable, it can make more of itself but change into something else. Telenomic and organic. Organic just means it's full of carbon as far as the chemists are concerned. Telenomic is a wonderful word because it's really tempting when you're doing evolution studies to fall into the characterization of saying, well, this animal evolved the human eye in order to be able to see, to hunt better, as if there was a direction, an end, a teleology directing the evolution. Now, the word telenomic was invented to say the same thing without making that kind of implication. But other than that, I can't tell the difference. Maybe some of the other biologists will get into the subtleties of the difference. Again, we have transferring, storing, and processing information as if we knew what information was, because, in fact, what's information to one operating system is random gibberish to another operating system. It's based on template and sequence-directed reactions. Basically, they're talking about DNA and how the atoms line up and reproduce themselves. Autopoietic entities, they reproduce themselves. So they're reproductive objects that reproduce into reproducing objects. Lucas Mix is going to be giving a series of talks. He was to be the Episcopal chaplain here, and he's also a biologist now at Harvard. And he's come up with other definitions he's seen through history, Wies and Fox. Anything that can be related to the tree of life must itself be alive, which is really limiting if you're trying to look for life elsewhere. Darwin, anything that evolves by natural selection will be alive. So if I'm going to go to a planet, I have to stand and watch these entities for about 10,000 years to see if they change. Haldane, anything with homeostasis maintains chemical equilibrium. This is a little bit closer to the kind of working definition that most people are interested in. Because one of the characteristics of life is that it is, among other things, a chemical process. And it's a chemical process that maintains an equilibrium, but it's not a particularly stable equilibrium. Now, when we're teaching freshman physics, we try to give the idea of an equilibrium. You have a valley, and you roll the ball down, and it goes and sits in the bottom of the valley, and it's at equilibrium because it's not moving, and it's stable because there's no place it's going to roll to. If I have a hill, and I put the ball at exactly the top of the hill, it's at an equilibrium because it's not going to move because it can't decide which way to. It doesn't roll one way or the other. But it's not a stable equilibrium because the slightest breeze and it goes and then it's gone. If you have a hill and then a little dimple in the hill, you might have something akin to life. While it sits in the dimple, it's in a local equilibrium, but it doesn't take much for it to completely leave that place, and once it leaves there, it can never come back. Maybe the hill without the dimple is even best because you've got a little ball that's in equilibrium, but then you have to keep blowing on it with little gas jets or something to maintain it right. You need energy at the outside to keep it at that equilibrium. This idea actually goes back to Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. But then everything in science goes back to Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, so that doesn't tell us anything. One of the more interesting takes in the history of what is life questions comes from Erwin Schrödinger. Now, Schrödinger is not somebody you'd think of as being a biologist. Schrödinger certainly did know that the mechanistic view of the 19th century doesn't work because it was his theories and his explanations of quantum mechanics that showed that it doesn't work. Schrödinger is probably most famous in the world of biology for Schrödinger's cat. Schrödinger's cat is a way of explaining how quantum physics works. I won't try to explain it here because whenever I try to explain it to my students, first of all, they get very confused, and then secondly, they feel sorry for the cat. But to give you an idea of what he's talking about, take a look at this interesting film pulled off YouTube. It's alive. Little bugs moving around. Actually, it's not alive. Each of these are particles less than a tenth or a hundredth of the size of a human hair. We're able to see them by shining a laser through them, and the particles will forward scatter the laser light. And they're in water. And water has a certain temperature. Because they are so small, the water molecules hitting them from every direction do not completely hit them at the same rate in every direction, Once you get small enough, there's going to be, from moment to moment, a mismatch in the number of molecules hitting this way and the number of molecules hitting that way. And as a result, the little particles move back and forth in a totally random motion. Robert Brown figured this out. He saw this in pollen in the 1830s. It's called Brownian motion. And it was simple enough that people immediately understood it after they read Einstein's paper about it 100 years later. One of the things about this image is that it's only about a minute clip, and I'm running it backwards and forwards, and you can't tell the difference. At the scale we're looking at, there is no arrow of time. But what this shows, first of all, is that things moving isn't enough to declare that something's alive. And it reminds you that at small scales, the laws of physics are no longer absolute, rather they are probabilistic. All you can say is that on average, those particles are going to be in one place. On average, the particles don't move. But at any given moment, they might be moving one way or the other. Thinking about this, Schrödinger pointed out that to do biology in terms of a mechanism and a chemistry, you've got to have laws that absolutely work and work exactly the same way all the time. You can't have lots of randomness throwing things into the world, because though we do have mutations are slow and gradual and take years to develop. They can't be happening every couple of seconds. But the laws of physics only give you that kind of certainty when you're looking at really large things, where the probability of a very large ensemble averages out so that you can predict what's going to happen from moment to moment. If nothing else, this tells him that life must be based on genomes that are really, really, really big. And of course, he wrote this in 1944, almost 10 years before DNA was finally worked out, and the idea of the macromolecules that form genomes were truly understood. When it comes time to try and determine life, the temptation is to come up with these laundry lists of what life is and what life doesn't. But the longer the list, the more likely you are that you're going to be ruling out something you actually think is alive. Multiplication, heredity, variation. Mules don't reproduce, but they're alive. Jesuits don't reproduce, and they're... Dual income, no kids, dinks. You yuppies. You don't, and yet you're still alive. It can't be merely reproduction. It can't even be the possibility of reproduction that makes something alive or not alive. What's more, there are plenty of things that do reproduce that aren't alive. Fire reproduces. Plagioclase crystals reproduce. If you make a short list to try to stop it from being overly dependent, you can find lots of these examples. Mutability, self-duplication, okay. Are computer viruses alive? They reproduce. They can mutate if you merely make them clever enough. Heck, computer viruses, what about real viruses? Great debate. What about, one of the biologists kept saying, don't forget prions. Prion, that's a Japanese sport car, right? The prion. A prion is a protein that's been folded in a funny way. And then when it gets introduced into a cell, it induces all the other proteins to fold itself the same way. And what you're left with after a while is something like mad cow disease. It reproduces. But no one would say that the prion itself is alive. None of these definitions are useful if we only have a snapshot. We've landed our lander on Mars. We've only got a year or so to look at something to determine whether or not it's living. So these fail both in that they don't really draw the boundaries where we know the boundaries ought to be drawn. They fail in that they don't give us a way of making a machine that we can run the crucial experiment and say, yes, this is alive, no, this isn't alive. And of course, none of them answer the philosophical question, why am I interested in this entity instead of a lump of plagioclase? The answer that you usually get after hours over a beer when you talk to a biologist, it's, like the definition of pornography. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. The trouble with that definition, which fundamentally is the definition we're all going to be using, is that it does have certain cultural assumptions built in. Here's an example of a great case where that definition, that I know it when I see it definition, won out over all the other definitions. In 1984, a meteorite was found in Antarctica, and it was found in the Allen Hills, and when they looked at it, they said, this is really interesting. Tell the guys back at NASA when they open the bags, open this one first. And so it became Allen Hills 84001, because they knew it was the most important. Sure enough, it had all of the evidences that said chemically, isotopically, age dating, that it was from Mars. That's another hour-long lecture if you really want me to get into that. In 1996, a group of scientists at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, looking into this, found a number of things in this meteorite. It was the oldest Martian meteorite. It was 4 billion years old. It dated back to a period in Martian history when there was probably a lot of water, when there was a lot of carbon dioxide because there are carbonate minerals. So if there was ever going to be life, there might have been life at that time, and they found this little thing that looked just like a bug. Fossilized bug. But wait, along with that, they found polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which is the kind of gunk that comes off of your steak when you've burned it too long in the grill. It's what happens when life dies. They also found crystals of sulfides that are always associated on Earth with living creatures, and they also found tiny crystals of magnetite, which within their limit of the resolution were not inconsistent with the possibility that they were the kinds of pure magnetite crystals made by bacteria in order to let them use a magnetic field to know whether to swim up to the light or down away from the light. 4 independent lines of evidence, all saying this is a body that was formed when there was life around. This made it into the popular press. This made it into, the president made a news conference about it. It was presented, excuse me. It was presented at scientific meetings. No one in the field doubts that the evidence was as they presented it. They've been arguing about whether or not the crystals really were this kind of crystal or that, because it's also not inconsistent with other kinds of crystals. But it's not like no one could reproduce the evidence. You take the rock, you can find stuff more or less like this. Nonetheless, 20 years later, nobody believes that it's a hard evidence. And one of the people who will talk to you more about this, Tim Swindle, has a great story about this. I'll merely say that when he talked to people soon afterwards, while half the room would say it's worth looking into, and the other half of the room said, they were all looking at the same data. But it didn't pass the I'll know it when I see it test. And that's really the only test it didn't pass. Occam's razor says that if you have multiple hypotheses, you choose the simpler one. So maybe that's actually just an optical illusion that comes from weathering. Maybe the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons came from the exhaust pipe of the Skidoo in Antarctica that was pulled up next to the rock when they recovered it. I was in Antarctica. I know how they recover these things. Maybe The sulfides were made by other processes that have nothing to do with life, which we know happens. Maybe the magnetite crystals are actually a different kind of crystal and they're kind of fooling you. Which is the simpler answer? 4 lines of evidence that can all be explained by one hypothesis, life, or 4 lines of evidence that all can have non-life explanations. There's no calculus that will tell you which is the simpler one. At the end of the day, you just have to look at it and say, could be, I don't know, let's move on. The big trouble with saying, I'll know it when I see it, the common sense approach, is that common sense has changed over time. Back in the pre-scientific world, where the world was flat, there was water above and below the earth, a dome holding the water above, and if you dig deep enough, you get that water again. This is not something out of Genesis. When the guy wrote Genesis, the author of Genesis took the best science of their day, which was Babylonian science, which was based on the fact there's a flat earth with mountains at the edge. Go outside tomorrow morning in Tucson. Flat ground, mountains around the edge, there's a dome. If you don't see it, you're not paying attention. These were good observers. They're seeing what anyone could see. What they also saw was that things that were dead stood still, and things that were alive moved. What's more, the wind can make things move, and when animals breathe, they have wind going in and out, so they used the same word, anima, to mean the wind, to mean the soul, to mean the definition of an animal. Rivers flowed because there were living creatures in the rivers, the gods of the rivers, the goddesses of the rivers. The trees had gods and goddesses. Everything that moved was alive. Now, the Greeks had a little more sophisticated way of looking at it. Everything that moves is alive, except, of course, things that go up and down. Because rocks falling due to gravity, well, they didn't call it gravity, rocks falling due to the fact that Earth is trying to reach its natural place. Water that bubbles up from the ground when the rocks fall down because it's trying to reach its natural place. Bubbles in the water that bubble to the air because it's trying to reach its natural place. Fire in the air that's going upwards because it's trying to reach its natural place. Gives us the 4 elements and the 4 natural layers. That kind of motion is obviously nothing to do with life, but backwards and forward motion cannot be explained by this up-down force. And you look in the sky and you see stars that move, and planets that move among the stars in sometimes very complicated ways. So clearly, the planets themselves were imbued with planetary intelligences. And they somehow communicated with each other, sending little demons and little geniuses. And if you happened to be born when the genius of music was overhead descending on you, you'd be a musician. If you happened to be born when the genius of sleep was descending on you, then, well, I've been like that. Now, we laugh at the idea of demons and geniuses communicating. I'll talk to a particle physicist about virtual photons. Sounds very similar. What was also in Aristotle's philosophy was the observation that if you have muddy places, you will find animals in the mud, coming out of the mud. If you leave food out, after a while, even though the food is dead and rotting, animals will appear within the food. Different kinds of mud produced different kinds of mollusks. So clearly, we have the spontaneous generation of life out of inanimate material. You'll find this even in Shakespeare, where in Antony and Cleopatra, they're talking about the snakes and crocodiles that come from the mud of the Nile. To illustrate this, I went online and was looking at pictures of maggots and pictures of rotting meat and decided you'd probably rather see a picture of Pasteur. How was this disproved? Well, Redi in 1668 did experiments where he covered the meat so that flies couldn't land on it and left other meat uncovered, and by golly, the maggots only appeared where the flies landed on the meat. Pasteur had a much more complicated series of experiments. It's usually described as, oh, he put them in bottles and sterilized them. It's a lot more complicated than that. He was a very good scientist. And he pretty much showed that you could not observe life occurring any place that had been sterilized. You could only see life occurring where there was contact and possible contamination from microbes. This still left the question as to what made life so different from non-living things. Because there is such a quantitative difference between a rock and a maggot. Was there some essential ingredient, some vital force? If we had that vital force, could we stick it into our monster and create the Frankenstein monster? Or, alternately, if there is no vital force, then why shouldn't we be able to take pieces that are almost alive and get them going again? One thing that was known by the chemists in the early 19th century was that organic chemicals, which were rich in carbon, were a heck of a lot more complicated than inorganic chemicals. And every organic chemical had been made by an organism until Frederick Wöhler, by accident, synthesized urea and said, oh, I made this without any life around. You know, I did this in 1828. It's only a matter of time before we'll be able to create life in the laboratory. 200 years later. Even Pasteur himself was not sure whether or not there was this vital action going on. Furthermore, we have to remember in worrying about life in other universes, life on other planets, or even life here on Earth, that we've never lived in a time where we didn't ponder it. Whether we're talking about the creatures of ancient Greece, the mythologies of all the ancient cultures, the first travel to other planets science fiction story, which dates from AD 160. Even the Bible has got the Nephilim, the sons of gods, and angels for that matter. How would you know it if you saw it? Well, I come to science through the very, very holy and important gateway of science fiction. And one of the great masters of science fiction, Gene Roddenberry, the fellow who invented Star Trek, was once quoted as saying, if I'm going to put a creature on television and I want people to believe that it's alive, it doesn't matter what shape it is, it doesn't matter what form it is, it doesn't matter how many tentacles it has, it doesn't matter what color it is, as long as it's got 2 eyes, then everyone will know that it's alive. Our sense of what is living and what isn't is deeply embedded in the culture we live in, and we cannot remove ourselves from that culture. What do we know about life on other planets? Well, what do we know about other planets? As soon as Galileo and Kepler, working on the theories of Copernicus, had convinced the scientific world that planets were places like the Earth, or the Earth was a place like other planets, and a little hobby horse, by the way, don't ever think the medieval worldview was that the Earth was special for being at the center of the universe. Because if you read Dante, you dig through the Earth, what's actually at the center of the Earth? The lowest realm of the Inferno. That would mean the Inferno was the most important place in the universe. No. They thought the Earth was the bottom of the universe. When Copernicus said the Earth is a planet like other planets, it was promoting the Earth or demoting the other planets. But as soon as that idea was out there, Kepler and Wilkins and Godwin and de Bergerac are all writing stories about traveling to other planets. And what good is a story if you don't have people around? So it's traveling to other planets and interacting with other creatures. Kepler, you know, is the astronomer. Godwin was a bishop. de Bergerac was the great swordsman with the big nose. He was, actually. Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds. This was a book trying to describe a conversation between a countess and a philosopher on what lives might be present and could be possible on other planets, not just around our sun, but around other suns. These are speculations that go well into the 18th and 19th centuries. We look today for evidence of life on planets, recognizing that we have both our cultural assumptions and the fact that we're fighting against those cultural assumptions. There have been bursts of methane seen on Mars. Well, it was seen first by a telescope, but the evidence wasn't very good. So now they put a lander with a little detector to actually look for methane from the bursts from a detector on the lander. And they have found little bursts of methane which go away really quickly, which means they're being produced by something, rotting, decaying organic material, you know, the flatulence of cows, who knows? It could also be outgassing from the spacecraft that's holding the little instrument. We have looked at icy moons like Europa and Enceladus, and we have excellent evidence that there is liquid water under the crust. What's the excellent evidence? Every now and then you can see some of the liquid water squirting out through a crack on the crust. It's probably there. The first time anyone talked about life in an ocean of Europa was here at the University of Arizona at the Jupiter meeting in 1975. And it was a smart-alecky young graduate student who made this suggestion. And when I made that suggestion, Carl Sagan turned to me and said, if you've got a 100-kilometer crust of ice, or even a 10-kilometer crust of ice, how is there going to get sunlight into the water to drive the life? And that led to a whole series of other arguments. Can you have life where there is no sunlight? It's not as clear as you might think, either way. One great place that has been suggested for life is Titan. Titan is a moon of Saturn. It's covered with an atmosphere that's rich in nitrogen, sound familiar? About 1.5 times the pressure of the atmosphere here on Earth, not that bad. It's got mountains, it's got lakes, it's got rivers, it's got evidence of rain occurring. Of course, it also is about 200 degrees below 0 Celsius. How do you have lakes there? Because they're not made of water, they're made of liquid methane. Could you devise life that could function at a really low temperature like that? Well, maybe nature is very clever, and it can. I remember this was discovered by the Huygens probe, which was a probe built by a bunch of Europeans. I lived in Europe 20 years. I've gotten to know them. Some of my best friends are Europeans. One of them from the Netherlands came here to give a talk at the Lunar Lab a few years ago. And he said, we've done calculations. This is before the lander actually got to Titan. We've done calculations on the atmosphere of Titan. And it looks like the clouds should be liquid droplets, just like water clouds on Earth. And there should be rain that falls out of the clouds, just like rain falls here on Earth. But if our calculations are correct, that rain might actually evaporate before it hits the ground. Who ever heard of such a thing? Until we explained to him, go outside in the desert here. You see it all the time. Our assumptions of what is normal are so deeply built into our own experiences that it's very hard to break out of those cultural assumptions. It gets even worse when you start looking for life on other planets. There are thousands of planets, what we have confirmed, that we have seen around thousands of stars. Of those, we already know of a dozen or so that are close to being Earth-like in size, and another dozen that are close to being in regions that appear to be where water would be neither too frozen or too boiling to allow, so that we could actually have life present, the so-called Goldilocks zone. And of those dozen, there's actually one or two that are in both. They're Earth-like, and they're in regions that might have liquid water. If life is this weird, out-of-equilibrium chemistry, if life is this thing which is balancing on a teeter point, what's doing the balancing? Schrodinger had a wonderful description of it. He said, life consumes negative entropy. That explains it, right? It means that there is a source of energy which is allowing these incredibly complicated chemicals that make us alive continue to exist even when the sun goes away, so that we can still survive even at night. The way we do it on Earth is that we've got plants that take the equilibrium product, carbon dioxide, and break it into free oxygen. Oxygen is the second most reactive element in the periodic table. Oxygen wants to react with everything. It wants to react with the wood. It wants to react with your clothing. That's why we have fire departments. And because we can use this chemical reaction day in and day out, even though it's only produced during the daytime, we can maintain ourselves. But as a byproduct, we have this really reactive chemical agent, free oxygen. Another reactant agent like that, methane. If the temperatures are such that really methane shouldn't be in equilibrium, but you see it anyway, it's a biomarker. And free oxygen and methane are the kinds of elements that can be pretty easily seen in the atmosphere of a planet. So if we're going to use this chemical reaction to describe what life is and look for the products of it, we might be able to see it. We might be able to say that this is not inconsistent with the possibility of life there. But it's never a proof. And in the meanwhile, the science fictional people can come up with marvelous examples that we haven't thought of yet, that we wouldn't see if we have our expectations of life too narrow. What is life and how does it function? Life arises out of the spontaneous reactions of inanimate. That's spontaneous generation. No, actually, that's what every theory for the origin of life ultimately says. It doesn't go so quickly from mud to a mollusk. But whether it happened overnight or it happens over a period of 1 billion years, ultimately our chemical theories of life still assume some kind of spontaneous generation. From all we have learned about the structure of living matter, we must be prepared to find it working in a manner that cannot be reduced to the ordinary laws of physics. Vitalism. No, Schrodinger. Pointing out that you have to, at the scale that things are happening in biology, you have to take account of quantum effects. I know it when I see it. What if you were raised on a desert island, and the desert island was surrounded by trees, and you had a pretty good idea of what a tree was, and then somebody showed you that? How would you know that that was also a tree? You need more than one example to be able to determine what are the essentials and what are the accidents, to use the words of Aristotle. I know it when I see it. What are the characteristics that tell me something about the center of what it means to be alive? Some of the things that I hoped I would be able to see in any entity that is alive. Life does change. It changes both for the better and for the worse. And sometimes these changes occur simultaneously, and sometimes you can't be sure what is better, what is worse. This is a photograph of Pope John Paul II. When I first arrived at the Vatican more than 20 years ago, I got to meet Pope John Paul II as a young man, very well educated, very sharp, great guy, wonderful skier. I have to confess, don't tell anybody, but as long as it's just among us. After meeting him the first time, I was a little disappointed because, he was just a guy. He puts his cassock on one arm at a time like the rest of us. But he got older, and he got weaker, and he got more frail. And by the early 2002, 2003, 2004, an amazing thing happened when you saw him in a public audience. We have these summer schools where we bring students from around the world to study astronomy, and at the end of the school, they get to meet the Pope, usually. And it'd be some of the students would be Catholics, and they'd say, oh, cool, I get to meet the Pope. And some of them would be harsh atheists. I don't want to meet this Pope guy. And after they met John Paul II, the Catholics would go, yeah, that's pretty cool. I got to meet the Pope. And the atheists would go, oh, my God. Oh, my God. Because, and I don't know how to describe it, but there was something about this guy. Agree with him or disagree with him, love him or hate him, follow his theology or not. He had a power at the end of his life that he did not have when he was young and vigorous. People change, and the changes are complicated. Living entities are unpredictable, like the little bob things going around in the Brownian motion, but they are not random. If you follow a cat, the cat is always going to surprise you. But afterwards, you can work out, oh, okay, that's what that cat was doing. And yet, once you've worked it out, you can't go then and predict what the cat's going to do again. Entities that are unpredictable but not random. That's maybe what you mean by a flow of energy. On the other hand, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to send a probe to another planet and wait for cats, much less to talk to their elders and see if they have that same wisdom that the elderly Pope had. Life can die. We go back to Engels. It's not that there isn't life on Earth, which is, in one sense, immortal. Bacteria, in a sense, never die from old age. You can kill them. Something that is alive is something that can be killed, and it's different from a machine breaking down because you can take an old machine, polish it up, install a few new parts, and it works again. But when death occurs, it occurs catastrophically. When that equilibrium is finally lost, it crashes. There is something about the complexity of life that means that death is an essential part of life. And yet, 50 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, will we be able to take the pieces of Frankenstein's monster and actually glue them together and make them work? I don't want to have a definition of life that is overwhelmed by changes in technology. And yet this is something that I feel is an essential part of what we are looking for in our cultural biases of 2015 when we say we're looking for life. Most importantly, though, we will not know life until we see more than one example. The two fish are looking at the snow globe, and now they've got a second universe to look at. And the one says to the other, great, now I'm going to have to come up with a whole new cosmology. Neither of them recognizing that they're on a table, on a planet Earth, which we all know is flat and surrounded by mountains and has a big dome over it, just like the snow globe does. Or maybe it's surrounded by crystalline spheres, like the fishbowl is. Our knowledge is always going to be incomplete. That's why we keep looking. There's one more thing, though, to get back to my original point, that we have to understand not only the question of what is life as opposed to what makes life interesting, as opposed to how can we find it, how can we describe it. You can go to a Best Buy and get a really good plasma screen TV. You can get one with 3D glasses. You can see immensely fascinating 3D films in this plasma TV. Now, the plasma TV has behind it a whole set of pixels. And the pixels are very complicated. If it weren't for the pixels, the TV wouldn't work. So what's real? The image that you're seeing in your head with the 3D glasses, or the pixels making the image? Well, to quote the great philosopher Dumbledore, just because it's in your head doesn't necessarily mean it isn't real. Because while it's true that the pictures would never be created without the pixels, no one would ever have built the pixels except that they wanted to watch the movie. And furthermore, confusing the two things, if you're looking at the movie and you suddenly are able to see the pixels, something's gone very, very wrong. That's the fundamental philosophical mistake behind vitalism, because it reduces whatever life is to one more magic ingredient. And people want to say that this is supernatural, this is the thumbprint of God. Not only is it the God of the gaps, but it's reducing God to one more chemical that we just hadn't distilled before. At the end of the day, we have to remember that we live in a universe both of pixels and of stars, and of the images of pixels and stars that are inside our brain. As you've heard, the seven of us who have these lectures going have talked a lot among ourselves. When I first presented these ideas to that group, I said the important thing to remember is that we have to talk about more than just the pixels at the end of the day. We can talk about life, what is life, why is life functional, how can we find it in other planets, but we should never forget the reason why we're coming to 7 lectures on life and not 7 lectures on plagioclase. And at that, I hope that the other people here will be able to get as many good laughs out of you as I've been able to get. Thank you very much.